Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. Baruch Adonai Eloheinu divrei Torah לפי בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי בית ישראל. כולנו יודע שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה, ברוך אתה אדוני מלמד תורה לעמו ישראל.
אמן.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בך בנו מכל עמים, ונתן לנו את תורתו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
Share to Jack Mayer Roberts, for Yaakov Ben Nachum. All right, we're going to start with the Mishnah Brewers, section 178. Davening in the middle of the meal. So if you're in the middle of a meal and then realize that you need to daven, the same rules apply. So in other words, there's a hefsek, you wait. Even though it's impossible to eat while davening, and it's considered a major interruption from the meal, you still make a new before brocha, a brocha rishona, for non-bread, non-mezonot items only. Okay? So in other words, if you start off and say Borei Priya 8, and then realize you have to daven, you daven, and then you do a new Borei Priya 8. So keep in mind that if there were people left at your meal and you davened in the same house, you've not changed your place at all, and you do not need to make any new brocha. If you got a shul in the middle of a bread meal, you should wash without a brocha, because obviously you washed before you go into the shul. And then when you return, in case you've touched something that dirtied your hands, but you don't make a new brocha of hamotzi. So in other words, if you're now separating location and you want to daven in a minyan, and you're still within your 72 minutes, and you just want to do a quick mincha, which will take about 12-15 minutes. When you come back, you wash your hands, but no new hamotzi. Say you fell asleep in a meal. I think it hasn't happened to me. If a person falls asleep unintentionally, you do not need to make any brachas when you wake up and continue eating. This is not called an interruption to one's meal. However, if a person intentionally goes to sleep, such as on his bed or couch, he has effectively ended his meal. And obviously, guys, you'll have to make a new bracha when you restart eating. In both cases, you must wash your hands without a bracha before starting to eat again. It goes without saying that if it's intentional that you're going to go to sleep, you might as well bench or do a bracha achrona, whether it's from mizonot or just borei nefashot. Okay, so that's from both the Mishnah Brura, section 178, as well as the and that's in the subsection 47. In the Shulchan Aruch, it's on section 178, subsection 6. Okay, guys, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. And now we're going to get straight to the Gemara itself. Marco, did you have a chance to listen yesterday?
I must be honest, Dan.
Yeah.
A bit of catching up to do. I don't know why. I'm talking normally. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. No, I haven't had a chance to catch up yet, so I'm one share behind. But I've done the reading.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
That's absolutely fine. So you're certainly not going to have a problem as far as that's concerned, because to a certain way is a diversion of when we discuss different custodian roles, and if a lender damages a borrower's ox, well, borrower damages a lender's ox. So because it was a diversion, a very important diversion, you can catch it up, but it's not going to affect the flow of the Gemara for you, which is lucky.
Right.
So guys, I just wanted to discuss each of the 4 shomrim, because each of them have its own set of responsibilities. So again, an unpaid custodian, which is called a shomer chinam, he's unpaid, is liable if the object in his care is damaged as a result of his negligence. If it is lost or stolen, however, he is exempt. Now, we're not talking about the loss of negligence, because if you say you lost it, you're negligent. I'm not talking about that. We're talking about if it lost its use. Does that make sense? If it actually lost its use or was stolen, you are exempt if you're an unpaid custodian, but you're liable for negligence. All right. A paid custodian, which is a shomer sachar, has a greater degree of responsibility. Why? Because, why, guys?
It's paid.
It's paid, exactly. So in the case where you're an unpaid custodian, you're doing the guy a favor. And if you're doing the guy a favor and he's going to take you to court on every little thing, you're going to say, listen, pal, you're going to Australia, get somebody else to be the sucker. I don't want to have any part of it. But if you're paying him, it's up to his responsibility because he's gaining something out of it. Okay. So you're liable even if an item is lost or stolen. And when we say lost or stolen, if it disappears, if it lost its usefulness, if it was stolen, but if it's lost in an unavoidable accident, and this is why I said the word lost isn't misplaced, because if you lose something, what is that? It's negligence, guys. If you lose something, is it not?
Yes.
So that's why the Gemara uses the term lost due to an unavoidable accident with regards to a paid custodian, because it says it's lost its use, like it was struck by lightning. That's the example the Gemara gives. And in that case, he is exempt because it's such an unusual way to lose an item in an unavoidable accident. But if it's lost or stolen, meaning it's rendered normally, it's like not an act of God, for example, and it's rendered loss of use or it's stolen or you're negligent, a paid custodian is fully responsible. So a borrower, a shoel, assumes even greater responsibility for he's liable even if the item is lost unavoidably. However, if the item breaks in the course of its normal use, for which you borrowed it, even he is exempt. So we use the example of a car. You know, you borrow a car one day and the head gasket blows. It's obviously not your fault. That had been building up for a long time. So that was the normal use that you used the car. You weren't dousing anybody on Louis Burta Avenue. All right? So that in that case, you're exempt. But for every other case of a borrower, why? Because the guy's doing you a huge favor. So what we learned yesterday is that you can make a specific contract with any of these shomrim that do differ, but this is the default position of civil law. And Michael, you will re-go through that shiur to see how that contract can be amended. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, good. The status of a renter, a shochar, also, a socher is the subject of a Tanaic dispute. Some maintain that it's recorded the status of an unpaid custodian. Some say he's like a paid custodian. We discussed this before. This was in 4b2, okay, that we discussed. But one thing, the fact that the Gemara in 4b2 on note 12 discusses, and on the following page, it says that an unavoidable loss, an unavoidable accident, in other words, a loss due to an unavoidable accident like being struck by lightning, implies what? That lost isn't that you can't find it. It implies that the item has lost its usefulness. Because again, if it's lost, as opposed to somebody else stealing it, that's considered negligence. That's what it would appear here. All right. Now that we've gone through the 4 shomrim, I thought that would just be a little bit clear. I hope that's been helpful, guys. Okay. Right. Pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Now, what we're going to discuss is we're on 14A1. We finally hit 14. So with tomorrow losing a shiur, and last week Sunday, because I traveled to Durban, we lost 2 shiurim, but there's nothing we can do. All right. So the Gemara returns to its discussion of the status of a jointly owned yard. Rav Elazar maintains that if the animal of one's partner does shame or regular damage to the property of the other partner, the damager is exempt for the damage because it's not being viewed as having been done in the field of another. Okay, so the Gemara challenges the view from the Brisa. Do you remember Rav Elazar basically joined those those two sentences together. So what sentences did he join? He's exempt in the field of a damager. In other words, if I go to Kevin's field and I take my chihuahua, escapes and goes into Kevin's field, and Kevin's got a Rottweiler and eats my chihuahua, Kevin will say, what was your chihuahua doing in my field? You do not have permission to be there, nor does your chihuahua. Therefore, I'm exempt. So that's if you enter the damager's field, the damager is exempt. He damaged your thing, but you had no right being there. So then that verse continues, and in the field of the damager and damaged. So basically, Rav Elazar doesn't put a full stop there. So he's reading that in the field shared by the damager and the damaged, there's also an exemption. Does that make sense, guys? So that's his first proof, Rav Elazar. Rav Elazar's second proof is that what is viewed as being a requirement, remember we said in Shmot, that we said it has to be done in the field of another. So if you part owner in something, according to Rav Elazar, it's your field also. It's not classically the field of another. Does that make sense? That's his second proof.
Yeah.
Guys, are you all following me?
Mhm.
Okay. So fine. This is only with regards to Shane or regal damage. Okay? Because as we said,
Carrying it out.
yeah, what we said exactly that, Marco, is that as far as Karen is concerned, you could have your ox attacking my ox. It doesn't matter where it is. In fact, there's nothing to do with the land that you're on. It's your item damaging mine. You're not damaging my property in terms of my ground, and it could be in outer space on the moon. You would be responsible. So it doesn't use the term in Shmot chapter 22, verse 4, in the field of another. So this is just discussing Shane and regal damage. For Karen, you're obviously liable. Okay? So far, that was good. Now, what we're going to discuss is, now that we understand Rav Elazar's point of view from the Brisa, and I'm sorry I had to repeat it, but we did this 2 shiurim ago. So I thought a recap is always nice for a minute. I hope it was. But there seems to be a challenging view. Is it indeed so that one is exempt from shane or regal damage in such a case? Rav Yosef taught in a brisa that states, in a yard belonging to partners or in an inn, one is liable for shane and regal damage done by his animal there. This brisa is seemingly a refutation of Rav Elazar's view that one is not liable for shane and regal damage done by one partner to another in a jointly owned yard. So in other words, Rav Eliezer is saying that you're not liable for shane and regal damage done by one partner to another. And it seems that Rav Yosef taught that in a yard belonging to partners or in an inn, one is liable for shane or regal damage done by the animal there. Okay, now, can any of you guys remember what the refutation was? I mean, you know what the argument is. This is a brisa to contradict Rav Elazar. But can anybody tell me the logic from what you remember of your learning on Shabbos? Guys, I'm hearing it awkwardly mute.
Pause.
Okay.
Yeah, all of us pause.
All right. All right. So if we have a look, it's not the same. If I have an inn, let's not use the word an inn. Let's use the word let's have the word a guest house. I have a hotel. Okay. A hotel is not equivalent to a public domain. Why? Why, guys?
Because it's your property. It's private.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's private. It's restricted to use for the paying guests. That's it. So with regard to the law of damages, basically you want to be able to put down your goods without it being damaged by somebody else or their property. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in other words, if one guest at your hotel damages another guest's property, that guest is liable. And why? Because it's not in a public area. They both have right of admission reserved, and it's restricted to paying guests. A vagrant can't come and just rock up there. So in regard to the law of damages, it's classified as the field of another. Why? Because it's privately owned. Remember, one of the criteria for being in the field of another is it's not public. You've got two different areas. You've got, it either belongs to the damager, it belongs to the damaged, which is regarded as the field of another, or it's regarded to public property, which is not the field of another. The question we have here is, if both partners are in the field, is it considered field of another? But by making a guest liable for shame and regal damage done by his animal to the property of another guest there, according to Rashi, is classified as field of another. So this rationale, so say for example, you've got 30 guests at your hotel. Well, this is not during lockdown, but when things are busy, you've got a small little hotel. Think of it like Fawlty Towers and John Cleese. You've got 30 guests. And there, every guest is responsible if he does damage to the hotel as well as other guests. So Rashi is saying this rationale applies even more strongly in a case where there's a jointly owned yard. Why? Because there's only two partners. If it applies that your ox can't go and damage other guests' property, in the old days, think of a Western where there was a saloon. Remember the horses were tied outside with a rope? Yeah. Right, if the horse went into the saloon and smashed up the bar and kicked a lady in the head, you'd be responsible for that. Okay, and that's when there may be 20 or 30 guys in the saloon, right? So in that case, when there's a lot of people, if you're responsible, how much more so if it's restricted to just you and a partner? And the use of the property is restricted and the access is restricted, saying you're even more responsible for liability. So this is actually a very strong refutation. I don't know if you'd agree, by Rav Yosef. Okay, so we understand the case, guys.
Mm-hmm. No, sorry. It's actually come back to me, the whole case, from reading it. Thank you.
Pleasure. So Rav Elazar would say to you, do you think this is a refutation? But are there not brises that disagree with regard to this very issue? Okay. So it's been taught in another brisa. Rav Shimon ben Elazar would state 4 rules with respect to liability for damages, and I'm going to share those rules with you on the screen. So the reason that I'm going to share it on the screen is it's easier for you to read. Just give me one sec. These point by point notes. Listen, I did go through the Safaria. Safaria said this in a very complicated way, and it also was unclear on one of the terms. So I'd rather share my screen with these notes that I found. Okay. All right, guys. The argument, Rav Shimon ben Elazar says there are 4 general rules in damages. In the property of only the victim, one is liable for everything. So, guys, if you come and damage my property and you're not invited there and right of admission is reserved, you are liable for everything. Does that make sense? In the property of only the damager, one is exempt for everything. Again, if Kevin, if my Chihuahua goes in and gets eaten by your Rottweiler, I'm responsible because I wasn't allowed to be on your property. So therefore you are exempt. I had no right to be on your property. Does that make sense? So in the property of the damager, one is exempt for everything. In the property of the victim and the damager, such as in a joint yard or a valley, one is exempt for shane and regal and liable for keren and its tordos. A ton pays half damage and a muad pays full damage. Now, by the way, guys, this isn't the Gemara. This is the rule of Shimon ben Elazar, who holds that one is exempt for shane and regal in a jointly owned yard. But he says, for keren and its tordos, you're liable. Why? Because even in a public area, you are liable. Fine. In the property not of the victim and the damager, such as a yard that is not of both of them, or a valley, one is liable for shein in regel, but for keren and a tordot, you are, a tam pays half damage and a muad pays full damage. So what it's saying is for shein in regel, you are liable full damages. Keren, if it's a tam, it's half damages. If it's a muad, full damage. This is for keren and it's tordot. So Keren, goring would be the avos, and the tordos would be the way that an animal, what do you call it, exacts irritation, biting, kicking, squatting, pushing, etc., etc. Now, this is the part that is unclear at the moment, okay? What's the part that's unclear? Is that, what does it mean not of both of them? Does it mean that neither of them owe? Because if it's neither, it would seem like the public domain. And we know, according to the Gemara, that for shein in regel, you are exempt from the public domain. Does that make sense? So we're talking about here, it would seem to be a third party. So we're going to study what this exactly, what it means. We'll come to see now. But what we can hint at, it is that if Michael and Gavin and Arthur and Kevin are in a hotel and they damage a property in the hotel and none of them own it, it's not a public domain. The right of admission is still reserved because they're paying guests. Does that make sense? They're paying guests. Yep. It's not the public domain. So therefore, it's not of both of them. What do you mean? Is that you don't own it, but you have the right to be there because you're paying, but you don't have the right to damage. So this is what it seems to come to infer, and we're going to unpack it now. I hope sharing the screen made it a little bit clear. When I had it on Safaria, it was quite complicated. Okay, I hope this helped. All right. So what we're going to do, so we say Rav Elazar would say to you, think this is a refutation. There are not brasses that disagree with regard to this very issue, for it has been taught in another brisa. Rav Shimon ben Elazar would state 4 general rules with respect to the liability of damages. Again, in any place that is premises for the damaged party, but not for the damager, the damager is liable in full. Any place that is premises of the damager, but not for the damaged party to go into, the damager is exempt from all liability. In any place for both this one and that one, in other words, such as a yard belonging to partners or an area of open fields, the damager is not liable for shein in regel, damage done there, but is responsible for damage by goring, pushing, biting, squatting, and kicking. The owner of the tam pays half damage, the owner of the muad pays full damage, and in a place that is not for this one and not for that one, such a yard that does not belong to the two of them is liable to full damages for shein and regel damage there, and obviously for keren half if it's tam, and full if it's muad, and also for goring and the tordot, which is biting, pushing, squatting, and kicking. Okay. So why does he say in a yard that does not belong to the two of them? Because Rav Elazar holds that it's not considered the field of another if you are part owner in it. Does that make sense? In other words, you and I own a field together. And if we own a field together, Rav Elazar holds that in order to fulfill the biblical criteria, it would have to be the field of another. The minute you own shares in that field or have rights to it, in that particular case, it's your field also. So therefore, you are not liable. But in a place that's not for this one and not for that one, where you don't have ownership, you are liable for shein and regel, and obviously keren. All right, guys, is that clear so far?
Yep.
Okay. Having quoted this lengthy brisa in full, the Gemara now highlights the ruling of the brisa that supports Rav Elazar. Just put the phone on mute. The Brisa teaches at any rate that in a yard belonging to partners or in an area of open fields, the damage is not liable for shine and wreck or damage done there. This corroborates Rav Elazar's ruling. Okay. So it seems, now this is a peculiar part. That's the only thing I never understood, guys. When it says, the Brisa teaches at any rate in a yard belonging to partners or in an area of open fields, the damage is not liable for shine and wreck or damages done there. This corroborates Rav Elazar's ruling. So I tell you what is confusing about this, Arthur. You turn around and you give me 4 rules. And then I say that rule corroborates with your ruling. It would obviously corroborate with your ruling. Why? Because you made up the 4 rules. Am I right?
Correct.
So it would seem that there might be another Rav Elazar. This is Rav Shimon ben Elazar. So I think it could be the son of Rav Elazar. Does that make sense? Because if he's saying Shimon ben Elazar and the other one was Rav Elazar, Shimon ben is the son of Rav Elazar. So therefore, Kev, you with me? So therefore, the rule that corroborates cannot be the same person. So from what I understood here, Shimon might be the son of Rav Elazar, and he corroborates with his, and the father corroborates with the son in this particular case. Fine. Okay. Just thought I'd put that on a side note. So these 2 brises seem to contradict each other. What is the contradiction? Well, we said, hang on, in one case you're saying, in regard to a yard set aside, for the 2 of them, you're responsible. And the other one said, well, look, it doesn't seem you're responsible. So we're going to explain this. In regard to a yard set aside for both this one and that one, both their produce and their, it's set aside for both their produce and their oxen. Okay, so I've got a yard, Arthur, for me and you, and we're both partners. And this yard, you can have your produce there, you can grow your millies, and you can grow your vegetables, and you can have your ox. I can grow my millies and my corn and whatever it is I want to do and bring my sheep. Okay? So this is an ox, this is a particular area, a yard, that we can use both for produce, okay, as well as for oxen. And this sort of yard is not considered the field of another with respect to partners. And therefore, you're not liable for shine and wreck or damage done to each other there. Can you guys explain to me why? I want you to explain to me the logic.
I can try.
Sure, go for
Okay.
it.
So if you're using, I mean, if it's, from what I read up, if it's used for both, okay, for food and for the oxen, okay, you can't pay for damages because the animals are in the same area. If it's cordoned off where you have a separate thing, then you are responsible.
A separate thing? What do you mean by separate thing?
If you have a separate field that's not for oxen, okay,
Yes.
only for growing, then you are responsible for damages half or full. Okay. But if you have a shared field where you have the oxen within the same area as your produce, then you're not responsible.
Excellent, excellent. So this, Arthur, you hit the nail on the head. So if I'm sharing a field with Arthur, and that particular field we're both allowed to grow produce and we're both allowed to have oxen, it's considered like a public field. Okay, just like in a not a public field, sorry, a public property. Just like in a public property, anybody can bring their animal there, and stuff happens. That's fine. So what we're saying here is that if it's purely for produce, Arthur's saying correctly, if it's only for produce, and your partner brings the ox there, and it damages your produce, he's responsible. He has no right to bring the ox there. He's only right to grow produce there. So in that case, if it's produce there and he brings his ox, it's considered the field of another because the right of admission is reserved and his ox is not welcome. He can grow produce there, but he has no rights for ox. That's correct. And in the case where both of them have oxen, and it's permitted, it's unlike the field of another. Okay, so I'm just going to read an excellent author. Okay, so the Brisa taught by Rav Yosef holds that the damager is liable in the case of a jointly owned yard. Was said in regard to a yard set aside for their joint use for produce only, but not for oxen, exactly as Arthur said. But with respect to shade damage, such as a yard considered to be the yard of the damaged party, since the damager is not permitted to bring his ox into it, accordingly is liable. Okay, Arthur, correct. The Gemara offers support for the interpretation of the Brisa. This explanation can also be inferred from a precise reading of the two Brisas. So again, in Rav Yosef's Brisa, the law regarding a yard belonging to partners is taught as being comparable to an inn, which is a place where oxen are not usually allowed. But in Rav Shimon ben Elazar's Brisa, the law regarding a yard belonging to partners is taught as being comparable to an area of open fields where oxen are permitted to enter. So from the companion case in each Brisa, we see that there's a distinction between a yard where animals are allowed and one where they're not. Arthur, correct. Indeed, we learn from this the distinction is correct. According to this interpretation offered above, Rav Yosef's Brisa teaches that if a yard is used by both parties for produce but not oxen, the damager is liable for shame and regal damage done there. Now, the ruling is now questioned. So Rav Zera challenges this interpretation by Rav Yosef's Brisa and said, but since the yard is set aside for their joint use for produce, how can the damager be liable for shame and regal damage there? Because we need the damage to fulfill the condition and it consumes in the field of another in order for there to be liability. And in this case as well, it does not, because the damager has use of the field as well. So this is what Rav Zera is saying. He's saying, listen, I understand what you're saying, but essentially it's not the field of another. They're both partners that own the field. So yes, he bought his oxen there, and we can say that it did damage produce from the other partner, but it's not considered the field of another because they both jointly own the property. Okay, it's a good argument. So that's how Rashi explains Rav Zera. So thus there should be no liability for shame and regal damage there. Now, basically, Abaya says to Rav Zera, he answers it, and he said, since the yard is not set aside for use for oxen, we refer to it as the field of another, meaning the inn that is privately owned, where it's considered the field of another because the right of admission is reserved, that you can't just bring in there what you like and damage what you like, even if they both own it. It's a problem. It's just like people own a property together in timeshare, and the one guy has a party and turns the place into a sty and damages light fittings and everything is damaged. He is responsible. So that's what he's saying. He had no right to damage the property, even though it's jointly owned and not considered an apartment of the other or a field of another. So in light of this distinction established between the two Brisas, we actually see that they don't really disagree, Rav Chisda and Rav Elazar cited. Because Rav Chisda said what? If you damage in the field of a partner, you are liable. Rav Elazar says you're not. So Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, let us say that just as the Brisa do not disagree. In other words, they're talking about a circumstance now of not a general rule, but in case of what you're allowed on that property. The Amoraim, Rav Chisda and Rav Elazar also do not disagree. So that's perhaps Rav Chisda taught that one is liable in a jointly owned yard only with respect to a yard from which oxen are barred. And even Rav Elazar taught that one is exempt with respect to a jointly owned yard in which oxen are permitted. So this is what's being proposed. In other words, there's not a set rule that Rav Chisda says you're liable in all cases, and there's not a set rule where Rav Elazar says you're exempt in all cases. And it's proposing this. So Rav Achi of Dif said to Ravina, maybe it's the same case with Amoraim as with these particular, the previous argument. So Ravina says back to Rav Acha, indeed it is possible to interpret the ruling of Rav Chisda and Rav Elazar in this manner. But if you conclude that they disagree over the relative merit of the question posed by Rav Zera and the answer offered by Rav Abaye. So what it's basically saying is that the argument is not as broad as you initially thought. It doesn't mean there's no difference of opinion at all between Rav Chisda and Rav Eliezer, because they certainly disagree with regards to the actual interpretation of the Mishnah, as I showed you with their punctuation. But the Gemara means that they do not disagree in any point of halacha. Because if you conclude that Rav Chisda and Rav Eliezer do disagree over a point of law, their dispute is not as broad as we originally thought. Rather, they just agree in terms of a case that's jointly owned, that's used for produce and not for oxen. Okay, so the root of the argument is as follows. If a damager cannot bring his oxen into the yard, does that make it like a field of another with respect to the ox's damage? Meaning because you barred from bringing oxen, therefore it's considered, according to Rav Chisda, as the field of another, same as a buyer. As a buyer, and they're saying maybe Rav Chisda feels the same way. Or does it feel like Rav Elazar that says, listen, even if the oxen come in there, they're still both partners in it because they both own it, so it's not considered the field of another, which follows the view of Rav Zera. So what we're saying is it's a minor point that they disagree on, and it's not a big rule. Of in one case with Rav Chisda, you're liable for all the cases in a jointly shared yard. And Rav Elazar is saying that you're not liable in any case for a jointly shared yard. All right, so guys, we're going to end off on that note. I hope this was a little bit clear to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff, but yeah, I got it revised.
Okay.
But good,
Yeah.
good. Thank you.
And